Emma Sullivan stared at the towering glass building that pierced the Chicago skyline like a shard of crystal, her reflection fractured across its mirrored surface. The invitation had arrived 5 days ago, delivered by a woman in a sleek black suit who had waited while Emma signed for the heavy envelope embossed with a silver H. Inside, a single card had requested her presence at Hawthorne Technologies for a matter of significant mutual interest. The vague wording had consumed her thoughts ever since, turning over and over as she tried to imagine what Julian Hawthorne, a man whose face graced the covers of business magazines and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations, could possibly want with someone like her. The lobby swallowed her whole the moment she stepped through the revolving doors. Marble floors stretched endlessly in every direction, polished to such perfection that Emma could see the clouds reflected in them. Modern sculptures that probably cost more than her annual salary stood like sentinels between clusters of leather furniture where people in expensive suits conducted hushed conversations. She felt profoundly out of place in her department store blazer and shoes she'd owned since college, clutching her worn purse like a lifeline. A receptionist with flawless makeup and an expression that suggested she'd perfected the art of polite indifference directed Emma to a private elevator bank. One of the elevators required a keycard, and the receptionist handed her a temporary pass with instructions to proceed to the 48th floor. As the elevator climbed, Emma watched the numbers illuminate one by one, each floor taking her further from the ground and deeper into a world she didn't understand. Her stomach churned with anxiety and curiosity in equal measure. The elevator opened directly into a reception area that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon, the water glittering in the afternoon sun. The furniture was a careful blend of modern minimalism and understated luxury, everything in shades of cream, gray, and brushed steel. A woman in her 50s approached with the purposeful stride of someone who measured time in seconds rather than minutes. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Hawthorne is ready for you. I'm Rebecca Stone, his executive assistant. Please follow me." Her voice carried the efficiency of someone who had learned that every word should serve a purpose. Emma followed her down a corridor lined with abstract art that probably required an advanced degree to appreciate, past glass-walled conference rooms where serious people gestured at screens filled with data and charts. Finally, they reached a set of double doors made of dark wood that looked ancient and expensive. Rebecca knocked twice before pushing the doors open and gesturing Emma inside. The office beyond was designed to intimidate. Everything from the massive desk position to make visitors squint into the light streaming through the windows, to the uncomfortably modern chairs that forced perfect posture, to the color scheme of blacks and silvers that rejected warmth. And behind that imposing desk, rising as she entered, was Julian Hawthorne himself. Emma had seen photographs, of course. He was regularly featured in Forbes and Fortune, named one of the most eligible bachelors in America despite his well-known aversion to relationships and social events. But photographs hadn't captured the sheer presence of him. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to anchor a ship and a posture that suggested he'd never doubted himself for a moment in his life. His dark hair was styled with careless perfection, and his eyes were a startling shade of gray that seemed to assess and catalog everything in a single glance. He was handsome in the way that warning signs are beautiful, all sharp angles and hard lines, a face that might have been carved from stone by an artist who specialized in severity. He wore his wealth casually, a suit that fit him like it had been grown rather than tailored, a watch that probably cost more than Emma's car, cufflinks that caught the light with every precise movement. Everything about him communicated control, power, and an absolute intolerance for waste or inefficiency. "Miss Sullivan, please have a seat." His voice matched the rest of him, deep and commanding, leaving no room for negotiation. Emma sat on the edge of one of those uncomfortable chairs, her purse in her lap like a shield. Julian didn't sit immediately. Instead, he moved to the windows with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the city spread below him like a kingdom he ruled by right of conquest. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Emma counted her heartbeats, wondering if this was some kind of power play, a test to see if she would break first and demand to know why she'd been summoned. I'm sure you're wondering why you're here, Julian finally said without turning from the window. I had you investigated quite thoroughly, Miss Sullivan. I know about your father's heart disease and the 3 years of treatments that drained every penny your family had. I know about the medical debt you inherited when he passed away 8 months ago, debt that totals approximately $270,000. I know you work as a hospital administrator at Mercy General, that you have a bachelor's degree in healthcare management, and that you've been picking up extra shifts wherever you can to try to make a dent in bills that will take you decades to pay off on your salary. Emma's cheeks burned with humiliation and anger. The invasion of privacy, the casual way he laid out her struggles like items on a spreadsheet, was dehumanizing. If you brought me here to embarrass me, she began, but Julian turned then, and something in his expression stopped her words. I brought you here to offer you a solution to your problems. He moved to his desk and extracted a folder, placing it in front of her with the deliberate care of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. Emma stared at the folder but didn't touch it, waiting for the rest of whatever this bizarre situation was about. Julian sat now, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. My grandmother, Patricia Hawthorne, who founded this company with my late grandfather, passed away 7 months ago. In her will, she included specific stipulations regarding my full inheritance and control of Hawthorne Technologies. According to her wishes, I must be married before my 38th birthday, which is exactly 3 months from today, or control of the company transfers to a board of trustees until I fulfill this requirement. He paused, watching Emma's face for her reaction. Emma frowned, still not understanding where she fit into this strange puzzle. My grandmother was a traditional woman who believed that family and legacy were the cornerstones of a meaningful life. She never approved of my solitary existence. She viewed my dedication to work as a character flaw that needed correction, a sign that I'd become unbalanced and incomplete. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Julian's face, something that might have been resentment or grief or a complicated mixture of both. She believed marriage would humanize me, make me more well-rounded, force me to prioritize something other than profit margins and market share. She was wrong, of course, but her will is ironclad. I've had 3 separate legal teams examine it from every angle. There are no loopholes. I still don't understand what this has to do with me, Emma said quietly, though a cold sense of dread was beginning to coil in her stomach. Julian opened the folder, revealing a thick stack of papers covered in dense legal text. I need a wife, Miss Sullivan. Not a real wife, you understand. I have no interest in the emotional complications that come with an actual marriage. I need a woman who will fulfill the legal requirements for 1 year, after which we'll divorce quietly and she'll be compensated generously for her time and discretion. The words hung in the air between them, so absurd that Emma actually laughed. It was a short, shocked sound that escaped before she could stop it. You want to hire me to be your wife? Precisely, Julian said, as if he'd just proposed something completely reasonable like a standard employment contract. I've considered several candidates, but you meet all the necessary criteria. You're intelligent and articulate, capable of navigating social situations convincingly. You're unknown in my circles, which means there are no complicated prior connections to manage. You're clearly in desperate financial straits, which provides strong motivation for discretion. And, he paused, his eyes moving over her in a way that made her skin prickle with an uncomfortable awareness, you're attractive in an understated way that won't raise questions about why I might have chosen to marry you. The clinical assessment felt like being appraised by a jeweler examining a stone, valuable perhaps for certain purposes but ultimately just another commodity. Emma's hands tightened on her purse. This is insane. You can't just buy a wife. I'm not buying a wife. I'm proposing a contractual agreement with clearly defined terms, expectations, and compensation. Look at the paperwork, Miss Sullivan. I think you'll find the offer more than fair. Against every instinct screaming at her to walk out and never look back, Emma pulled the folder closer and began reading. The numbers made her head spin and her vision blur at the edges. All her medical debt, every penny of the $270,000, paid in full immediately upon signing. A monthly allowance of $60,000 for living expenses and wardrobe requirements. At the end of 1 year, a settlement payment of $6 million and a clean, no-fault divorce. The terms were laid out with the precision of a business merger because that was exactly what this was. Separate living quarters within his residence. No expectation of physical intimacy unless mutually agreed upon. Public appearances as required for social and business functions, estimated at 2 to 3 events per week. Complete discretion both during and after the arrangement, with severe financial penalties for breach of confidentiality. "You're actually serious about this," Emma whispered, staring at numbers that represented more money than she would earn in multiple lifetimes of 60-hour work weeks. "Completely serious. I need this problem solved, and I'm willing to pay for an effective solution. You need financial relief, and I'm offering you enough money to not only erase your debt but also completely transform your life. 1 year, Miss Sullivan. 12 months of your life in exchange for absolute financial freedom. No more debt collectors calling at midnight. No more choosing between groceries and rent. No more nightmares about losing everything your father worked for. You could go back to school, travel, do whatever you've been putting off because you couldn't afford to even dream about it." It was tempting in a way that made Emma's chest ache with longing. God, it was so tempting that she felt the yes forming on her lips before her rational mind could fully process the implications. But something made her hesitate, some instinct for self-preservation that whispered warnings about deals that seemed too good to be true. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "Surely there are other women, more sophisticated women with better wardrobes and social skills, who would jump at this opportunity." Julian's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that suggested she'd touched a nerve. Sophisticated women come with sophisticated expectations and complications. They have social circles that would ask intrusive questions, families that would want involvement, careers that might be impacted by a sudden marriage and divorce. You have none of those entanglements, Miss Sullivan. According to my research, you're essentially alone in the world. Your mother passed away when you were 12. You have no siblings. Your father's death severed your last significant family connection. Your college friends have mostly drifted away as your father's illness consumed all your time and energy over the past 3 years. You've become isolated, which makes you perfect for my purposes. The words were brutal in their honesty, cutting straight to the core of Emma's loneliness. But she couldn't argue with the assessment. She had become a ghost in her own life, existing rather than living, going through motions of work and sleep and worry without any real connection to the world around her. What did she have to lose really, except a pride that couldn't pay her bills? What exactly would be expected of me? Emma asked, hating how small and uncertain her voice sounded. Julian leaned forward, his forearms resting on the desk, and for the first time Emma caught his scent, something expensive and masculine, cedar and leather and something darker she couldn't identify. You would move into my estate immediately following a private wedding ceremony. You would accompany me to social functions, business dinners, charity galas, any event where a wife's presence is expected or beneficial. You would play the role of a devoted spouse in public, maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage. In private, we would maintain separate lives within the residence. You would have complete freedom to pursue your own interests within reasonable boundaries. We would present a united front to my family, business associates, and the media. After 1 year, we would divorce, citing irreconcilable differences or the standard incompatibility language. The narrative writes itself, and the physical intimacy clause? Emma forced herself to ask, her face heating with embarrassment. Not required or expected, Julian said with flat finality. I have no interest in complicating this arrangement with sex. This is purely a business contract, nothing more. Something about the way he said it, with such cold certainty, made Emma wonder about the man beneath the polished exterior. What had happened to make him so closed off, so determined to keep everyone at a calculated distance? But she pushed the curiosity aside. It wasn't her business to understand him. This was about survival, about grabbing a lifeline when she was drowning. "I need time to think about this," Emma said, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. How could she possibly say no? "You have 48 hours, Julian replied, sliding a business card across the desk with his private contact information on the back. "Call with your decision. If you agree, we'll move quickly. The wedding will take place within 3 weeks. I've already made preliminary arrangements with several venues and obtained a marriage license. We'll need time for you to be properly outfitted, briefed on the basics of my business and social circle, and integrated into my life in a believable way." He stood, clearly signaling the end of their meeting, and Emma rose as well, her legs unsteady beneath her. She clutched the folder and the business card like talismans against the unreality of what had just happened. As she reached the door, Julian spoke again. "Miss Sullivan." She turned, and for just a moment she thought she saw something flicker in those steel-gray eyes, something almost vulnerable beneath all that calculated control. "I haven't had a woman in 5 years." The confession seemed torn from him against his will, and immediately his expression closed down again, walls slamming back into place with almost audible force. "I'm telling you this so you understand the nature of what I'm proposing. I'm not looking for romance or love or any of the illusions people attach to marriage. That part of me died a long time ago. If you accept this offer, don't expect me to suddenly transform into someone I'm not. I'm offering you a business arrangement, nothing more and nothing less." Emma didn't know what to say to that strange, raw admission, so she simply nodded and left, her mind reeling with everything she'd learned and everything she was about to decide. The next 48 hours passed in an agonizing blur of deliberation. Emma walked through her tiny studio apartment, looking at the collection of past due notices stacked on her desk, the empty refrigerator she couldn't afford to fill properly, the worn furniture she'd inherited from her father's house before the bank foreclosed on it. She thought about her father, who had worked 2 jobs his entire life to provide for her, who had sacrificed everything for her education and future. What would he think of this decision? But her father was gone, and Emma was alone, and drowning people didn't have the luxury of pride or principles. She called the number on Julian's business card at 11:30 on the second night, 30 minutes before her deadline expired. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. "I'll do it," Emma said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'll marry you." There was a pause, and then Julian's voice came through, cool and businesslike as ever. "Good. Rebecca will contact you tomorrow morning with all the details and arrangements. Welcome to the agreement, Miss Sullivan." 3 weeks later, Emma stood in a private dressing room at the Peninsula Hotel, wearing a wedding gown that cost more than her car and looking at herself in the mirror with the strange sense that she was watching someone else's life unfold. The dress was exquisite, ivory silk that draped and clung in all the right places, elegant without being ostentatious, exactly the kind of dress a successful billionaire's bride would wear. Her hair had been professionally styled into an intricate updo that showed off the diamond earrings Rebecca had delivered that morning with a note that they were on loan from Julian's family collection. Makeup artists had transformed her face into something camera-ready, all glowing skin and subtle enhancement. She looked like she belonged in Julian's world, but inside she was still the girl drowning in debt and desperation, selling a year of her life because she had no other choice. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of flash photography and forced smiles. Julian had invited 200 guests, business associates, distant family members, society figures who had accepted the sudden wedding announcement with varying degrees of surprise and speculation. Emma had no one on her side of the aisle except a handful of people Rebecca had hired to fill the seats and maintain the illusion of normalcy. Julian looked devastating in his custom tuxedo, every inch the powerful billionaire claiming his beautiful bride. When he took her hand at the altar, his grip was firm and impersonal, his expression unreadable. He recited his vows with the emotional inflection of someone reading a quarterly earnings report, which Emma supposed was exactly what he was doing in his mind. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Julian kissed her. It was a brief, chaste press of lips that was over before Emma could process the warmth of his mouth against hers. But even that fleeting contact sent an unexpected jolt through her system, something electric and unwelcome that she immediately suppressed. This wasn't real. She couldn't afford to forget that fundamental truth. The reception was held in the hotel's grand ballroom, transformed into something out of a fairy tale with thousands of white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and champagne flowing like water. Emma smiled until her face ached, accepted congratulations from strangers, and played the role of the blushing bride while Julian worked the room with ruthless efficiency, conducting business while maintaining the pretense of celebration. But there was one moment during their first dance when something shifted between them. The band played something slow and romantic, and Julian pulled Emma into his arms with the smooth competence of someone who'd learned ballroom dancing as a child. His hand settled at the small of her back, warm through the thin silk of her dress, and when she placed her hand on his shoulder, she could feel the solid muscle beneath the expensive fabric of his tuxedo. They moved together in silence for several measures, and Emma became acutely aware of how close they were, how his cologne filled her senses, how his chest rose and fell with each breath. She risked a glance up at his face and found him looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been curiosity, as if he was seeing her as a person rather than a solution for the first time. "You're handling this better than I expected," Julian murmured, his lips close enough to her ear that she felt the warmth of his breath. "So are you," Emma replied, keeping her smile in place for the cameras she knew were watching. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "This isn't an act for me. I don't do anything halfway, even convenient marriages." Before Emma could respond, the song ended and Julian released her, stepping back with his usual controlled distance. But something had happened in those few minutes, some awareness had sparked to life, an acknowledgement that they were two people trapped in close proximity, playing roles that might become harder to maintain than either of them had anticipated. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the hotel staff had begun cleanup, Julian drove them to his estate in complete silence. The house was located in an exclusive area north of the city, hidden behind gates and perfectly manicured grounds that stretched for acres. It was beautiful in a cold, impersonal way, all modern architecture and floor-to-ceiling windows, more showpiece than home. Rebecca met them at the door and led Emma through the cavernous space to what would be her wing of the residence. Yes, her own wing. An entire section of the house with its own bedroom suite, sitting room, private bathroom larger than her entire studio apartment had been, and a walk-in closet already stocked with clothes in her size. "Mr. Hawthorne's quarters are in the East Wing," Rebecca explained in her efficient tone. "You'll find everything you need here. The household staff manages all cooking, cleaning, and maintenance. Your wardrobe has been selected according to the specifications Mr. Hawthorne provided. If you require anything additional, there's an intercom system. Simply press the button labeled Main House." Emma stood in the center of the bedroom, surrounded by luxury that felt suffocating rather than comfortable, and nodded mechanically. This was her life now, gilded and empty, purchased and paid for. After Rebecca left, Emma changed out of her wedding dress and into the silk nightgown that had been laid out on the bed, part of a trousseau she hadn't selected. She wandered to the windows overlooking the dark grounds and tried to reconcile what she'd done. She was married to a stranger. She lived in a mansion. She'd sold a year of her life for money. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting Rebecca with some final instruction. But it was Julian who entered, still in his tuxedo pants and white shirt, though he'd discarded the jacket and loosened his tie. He looked less polished now, more human, and Emma's pulse quickened at the unexpected intrusion. "I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed," Julian said, though his eyes stayed fixed on her rather than surveying the room, and Emma became suddenly aware that she was wearing only a thin nightgown. "It's all very generous," Emma replied, wrapping her arms around herself. Julian nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he moved further into the room, his hands in his pockets, his expression troubled in a way she hadn't seen before. "This arrangement is unconventional. I'm aware of that. But I want to be absolutely clear about the boundaries. We'll maintain separate lives. You're free to pursue your own interests, make your own friends. I ask only that you're discreet and available when needed for public appearances. I understand. That was all in the contract. Yes. Another pause, heavier this time. But contracts don't account for human factors. If this becomes unbearable, if you need to end it before the year is complete, I won't hold you to the financial penalties. I won't, Emma interrupted. I made a commitment. I'll honor it. Something flickered across Julian's face, respect or relief. You're stronger than you look. I've had to be. They stood there in the dim light of her new bedroom, two strangers bound by papers and promises, and for a moment the space between them felt charged with all the things they weren't saying. Then Julian stepped back, retreating toward the door. Good night, Emma. He'd used her first name for what might have been the first time. Good night, Julian. He paused at the threshold, his back to her. That confession I made in my office about the 5 years. I don't know why I told you that. It was inappropriate. Emma's heart squeezed with unexpected sympathy. It made you seem human. Less frightening. Julian's shoulders tensed. Don't make the mistake of thinking I'm anything other than what you see. I'm exactly as cold as I appear. This arrangement works precisely because I'm incapable of the emotional connections that complicate marriages. If you say so, Emma said softly. He left without another word, and Emma was alone again in her beautiful prison, wondering what kind of pain had frozen a man so completely that he would rather pay for a wife than risk his heart with a real one. She climbed into the enormous bed, surrounded by expensive linens and perfect silence, and stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the windows. Her life as Mrs. Julian Hawthorne had begun, and she had no idea if she'd just made the best decision of her life or signed away her soul for the promise of financial salvation. Only time would tell, and she had a full year to find out. The first weeks of Emma's marriage to Julian Hawthorne unfolded with the strange, disconnected quality of living in a beautiful museum where she was both visitor and exhibit. Emma woke each morning in her luxurious bedroom to find sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, took breakfast alone in the sunroom while Julian had already left for his office by 6 o'clock, and spent her days wandering the vast estate like a well-dressed ghost haunting someone else's life. The house itself was a marvel of modern architecture and carefully curated emptiness. Every surface gleamed with the attention of a staff that moved through the rooms like spirits, appearing and disappearing as needed but never intruding on the peculiar isolation that defined Emma's new existence. There was a state-of-the-art gym she felt too intimidated to use, an infinity pool that overlooked the lake, a media room with a screen that could rival any theater, and a kitchen so pristine she felt guilty making toast. But it was the art studio that captured Emma's attention and refused to let go. She discovered it on her 4th day in the house, tucked away on the 2nd floor behind a door she'd assumed led to storage. Instead, she found herself standing at the entrance to a sun-drenched sanctuary that revealed a side of Julian Hawthorne the business world would never recognize. The room was filled with natural light from skylights and large windows. Easels stood in various stages of use, some holding finished canvases, others blank and waiting. Paint-splattered drop cloths covered portions of the hardwood floor. Shelves lined one wall, packed with tubes of oil paint, brushes of every conceivable size, palette knives, and jars of turpentine and linseed oil. The air smelled of paint and possibility. But it was the paintings themselves that made Emma's breath catch. They weren't the abstract corporate art that decorated the rest of the house. These were deeply personal works, mostly landscapes rendered in moody, atmospheric styles that spoke of loneliness and longing. Stormy seascapes with turbulent waters. Empty city streets at dawn. Solitary figures standing at the edge of vast spaces. Each painting was signed with a simple J in the lower right corner. On an impulse she couldn't fully explain, Emma found a sketchpad and charcoal pencils in one of the drawers and left a simple drawing on the main work table, a small sketch of the view from her bedroom window with a note written beneath it in careful script. I found your studio. Your paintings are extraordinary. They tell a different story than the one you show the world. Do you still paint, or have these become ghosts of an abandoned passion? She left the note there, marking it with a clean brush as a paperweight, and returned to her wing of the house, unsure what she expected but feeling for the first time since signing that contract like she'd done something genuine rather than performed something required. The next morning, when she returned to the studio with her coffee and a book she'd been reading, she found a response. Julian's handwriting was precise and controlled, the letters formed with almost architectural exactness. I paint when insomnia becomes unbearable and my mind needs something to focus on besides profit margins and market analysis. These pieces are therapy more than art. I'm surprised you found this room. Most people never venture beyond the main floors. Why are you interested in the abandoned passions of a man you barely know? Emma smiled despite herself and wrote back immediately. Because the paintings show me who you are when you're not trying to be Julian Hawthorne, Billionaire CEO. They show me the person underneath the armor. Also, because I'm bored and curious, and this is the first interesting thing I've discovered in this beautiful mausoleum you call home. Thus began their strange correspondence, a conversation conducted through handwritten notes left in the art studio that became their neutral territory, the one space in the house that felt lived in and real. They traded observations about art and philosophy, recommended books to each other, debated the merits of various painters and movements with an intellectual passion that Emma hadn't experienced since her university days. Julian's notes revealed a sharp, questioning mind and a surprising depth of feeling, though he seemed more comfortable expressing emotion about Rothko's color fields or Hopper's lonely figures than about anything in his actual life. Emma found herself checking the studio multiple times a day, anticipating his responses, feeling a small thrill when she found new words waiting for her. For weeks into their arrangement, Emma learned they would be attending their first major public event as a couple, a charity gala supporting children's literacy programs hosted by one of Chicago's most prominent families. Rebecca appeared at Emma's door with a designer and stylist in tow, and for an entire afternoon Emma was measured, pinned, and transformed into someone who might convincingly be Julian Hawthorne's wife. The dress they selected was a deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue undertones in her eyes, cut to skim her figure without revealing too much, sophisticated and elegant without trying too hard. The stylist arranged her hair in a sleek chignon that emphasized her neck and collarbones, and the makeup artist painted her face with subtle artistry that made her look polished and expensive. When Emma descended the main staircase the evening of the gala, she found Julian waiting in the foyer, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. For the first time since their wedding, she saw something flicker in his eyes as he watched her approach, a spark of genuine appreciation or interest that was quickly shuttered behind his usual controlled expression. "You look appropriate," Julian said, which Emma had learned was his version of a compliment. "You look like yourself," she replied, which earned her the ghost of what might have been a smile. The gala was held at the Art Institute, the grand halls transformed with dramatic lighting and floral arrangements that probably cost more than Emma used to make in a month. They arrived in Julian's Mercedes, and as they walked through the entrance with Julian's hand resting formally at the small of her back, Emma felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, judging her, wondering who she was and how she'd captured the attention of Chicago's most notorious workaholic. Julian introduced her with polite efficiency to an endless stream of business associates and society figures, and Emma smiled and made small talk and played her role with all the grace she could muster. Most people were politely curious, asking the standard questions about how they'd met, how long they'd been dating, making the usual jokes about Julian finally settling down. Emma delivered the rehearsed responses they'd agreed upon. They'd met through a mutual acquaintance at a hospital fundraiser. They'd been seeing each other quietly for several months and decided rather spontaneously that they didn't want to wait. The lies came easier than she'd expected, which troubled her more than she wanted to admit. It was during the cocktail hour, when Julian had been temporarily pulled away by a colleague who wanted to discuss some urgent merger, that Emma encountered Derek Morrison. She'd been standing near one of the museum's large windows, looking at the city lights reflected in the darkness, when a voice behind her said, "So you're the mysterious woman who finally thawed the Ice King's heart." Emma turned to find a man in his early 40s, handsome in a practiced way that suggested considerable time and money spent on maintenance. His smile was charming, but something about his eyes made Emma instinctively uncomfortable, a calculating quality like he was always looking for angles and weaknesses. "I'm Emma Hawthorne," she said, offering her hand with polite formality. "Derek Morrison." He took her hand, holding it just a moment too long. "Julian and I have a complicated history. We were once close friends and business partners, though I'm sure he's never mentioned me." "He hasn't," Emma admitted, wondering why she felt like she'd just stepped onto dangerous ground. Derek's smile widened. "No, he wouldn't have. Julian prefers to pretend certain parts of his past don't exist." "Tell me, Emma, may I call you Emma? How much do you really know about your husband's romantic history?" "I know what I need to know," Emma replied carefully, trying to spot Julian in the crowd. "Do you?" Derek moved closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Did he tell you about Natalie? About how she left him at the altar 5 years ago? About how she chose me over him because she couldn't stand another day with a man who treated her like a business associate rather than a woman?" The crude implication made Emma's cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment, but before she could formulate a response, a hand gripped her elbow, not roughly but with unmistakable possessiveness. "Morrison." Julian's voice was low and lethal, carrying a threat that needed no elaboration. "If I hear you've spoken to my wife again, if you've so much as looked in her direction, I'll destroy you. Not your failing business ventures. You personally. I'll ruin you so completely that you'll wish you'd never learned my name." The transformation in Julian was shocking. From controlled businessman to something dangerous and primal in the span of a heartbeat. His hand on Emma's arm was the only gentle thing about him in that moment. Everything else was pure, focused rage. Derek attempted a laugh that came out strangled. "Just making conversation, Julian. No need to get territorial. Get out of my sight." Samuel's words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Derek left quickly, disappearing into the crowd, and Julian turned to Emma, his expression shifting from fury to concern. "Are you all right? What did he say to you?" Emma was shaken by the encounter and by Julian's reaction, the raw protectiveness that seemed to contradict everything about their arrangement. "He made some crude comments about your past relationship. About Natalie." Pain flickered across Julian's face, quickly masked but not before Emma saw it. "Natalie was my fiancée 5 years ago. She left me for Derek the week before our wedding. It's ancient history and none of his business or anyone else's. He said she left because you were cold. Because you couldn't give her what she needed." Julian's jaw tightened. "Natalie left because I was building an empire and she wanted a man who would put her first above everything else. Derek was happy to play that role, at least until he got bored and moved on to someone else. I don't regret losing her. I regret that I didn't see who she really was before I wasted 3 years on her." There was so much pain beneath those words, so much carefully controlled emotion, that Emma acted on instinct. She reached up and touched Julian's face, her palm against his jaw, feeling the tension thrumming through him. "I'm sorry he hurt you," she said softly. "And I'm sorry he was cruel tonight." Julian went completely still at her touch, his eyes widening with something that might have been shock. For a long moment they stood frozen in that position, Emma's hand against his face, his hand still on her arm, the noise of the party fading into background insignificance. Then Julian pulled away, but gently, his expression shuddering once more. "We should circulate. People will notice if we stand here much longer." But something had shifted between them. Some boundary had been crossed, and Emma felt it in the way Julian's hand settled at her waist as they moved through the crowd, less formal now, more protective. She felt it in the way he stayed close to her for the rest of the evening, introducing her with a hint of pride rather than mere obligation. And she definitely felt it during the car ride home when Julian sat beside her in the back of the Mercedes and the silence between them was heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. When they arrived at the estate, Julian walked Emma to her wing, something he'd never done before. At her door, he paused, and Emma turned to find him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For handling Morrison with grace. And for defending me even though you didn't have to." "We're married," Emma replied, even though they both knew the truth behind that statement. "That's what partners do." Julian's hand came up, and for a moment Emma thought he might touch her face the way she'd touched his. Instead, his fingers brushed a strand of hair that had come loose from her chignon, tucking it gently behind her ear. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with his usual controlled distance, that Emma's breath caught. "Good night, Emma," Julian murmured, and there was something in his voice, a roughness, a hint of longing that made her pulse race. "Good night, Julian." He left, and Emma leaned against her closed door, her heart pounding, wondering what was happening to the careful boundaries they'd established. This was supposed to be simple, a business arrangement, nothing more. But the man who'd threatened Derek Morrison, who'd touched her hair with such unexpected gentleness, who painted lonely landscapes and wrote her notes about art and emotion, that man was becoming real to her in ways that felt dangerous. The following weeks brought more public appearances, more performances of marital happiness, and more moments when the performance felt less like acting and more like rehearsing for something genuine. There were charity dinners where Julian's hand would linger at the small of her back. Business lunches where he'd include her in conversations with an attentiveness that suggested he actually valued her opinion. Quiet evenings in the art studio where they'd sit in companionable silence, Emma reading while Julian painted, occasionally sharing passages or asking opinions on color choices. Emma found herself looking forward to the times when Julian was home, anticipating his return from the office with a flutter of excitement she tried to dismiss as mere boredom. She learned his routines and preferences, the small tells that indicated his mood. She discovered he took his coffee black with 1 sugar, that he ran 6 miles every morning at dawn, that he played piano late at night when he couldn't sleep, beautiful melancholy pieces that drifted through the house like ghosts of emotions he couldn't express in words. One night, about 7 weeks into their marriage, Emma woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the lake. She'd always hated storms, a childhood fear she'd never quite outgrown, and this one was fierce. Lightning that lit up her bedroom in stark white flashes, thunder that rattled the windows, rain that lashed against the glass like it was trying to break through. She tried to sleep, tried to ignore the way her heart raced with each crack of thunder, but finally gave up and wrapped herself in a silk robe, padding through the quiet house in search of comfort or distraction. Her feet carried her toward the art studio almost of their own accord. Light spilled from the half-open door, and when Emma entered, she found Julian standing before a large canvas, wearing nothing but worn jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, the most casual she'd ever seen him. He held a palette in one hand and a brush in the other, working on a turbulent seascape that matched the storm outside. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering across his features. "Storm keeping you awake?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emma nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "I've never liked them." "Silly, I know." "Not silly. We all have our vulnerabilities." Julian set down his palette and gestured to the worn leather sofa near the windows. "Would you like company? Sometimes distraction helps." Emma settled onto the sofa, drawing her legs up beneath her, and Julian poured her a glass of wine from a bottle he'd apparently been working through. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside the windows, and gradually Emma's anxiety began to ease. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said finally, emboldened by the wine and the strange intimacy of the moment. "You can ask. I may not answer. Why did you really stop having relationships? Was it just because of Natalie?" Julian was quiet for so long that Emma thought he wouldn't respond. Then he set down his wine glass and leaned back against the windowsill, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Natalie was a symptom, not the cause, he said slowly. The truth is, I built this company from almost nothing. My grandmother gave me a substantial investment and enormous expectations, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of her faith. I worked 80, 90-hour weeks. I sacrificed everything. Friendships, hobbies, any semblance of a personal life, because I believed that success was the only thing that mattered, the only way to honor what she'd given me. He paused, his jaw tightening with old pain. Natalie tried to fit into my world. For 3 years she tried. But I wasn't present even when I was physically there. I'd take calls during dinners, work through weekends we'd planned together, cancel trips at the last minute for business opportunities. She told me she felt like she was in love with a hologram, and she was right. That doesn't excuse what she did, Emma said quietly. Leaving you for your friend, especially right before the wedding. No, but I understand it now. She wanted someone who would make her feel loved, desired, important. Derek gave her that attention, even if it was ultimately shallow and self-serving. I gave her nothing but the crumbs of my time and the reflected glory of my success. That's not enough to sustain any relationship. Julian looked at Emma then, really looked at her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that took her breath away. After she left, I decided it was easier to be alone. Relationships require emotional availability I don't have. They require trust I'm not capable of giving. So I stopped trying. I poured everything into work, built my empire, and told myself I was satisfied with that. That it was enough. Were you? Emma asked. Satisfied? A bitter smile touched Julian's lips. I was functional, which is different. But it felt like enough until my grandmother's will forced me to confront what I'd become. A man so isolated that he had to hire a wife because he couldn't imagine opening himself up to the possibility of a real one. The confession hung between them, raw and honest, and Emma felt something crack open in her chest. Sympathy and understanding and an ache for this brilliant, broken man who'd built walls so high he couldn't find his way out. You're not as cold as you think you are, Emma said softly. Cold men don't paint emotions onto canvas. They don't write thoughtful notes about art and philosophy. They don't threaten people who hurt their wives, even their hired wives. Julian's eyes locked with hers, and the air between them suddenly felt charged, electric in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. You're making this complicated, he said, but his voice was rough with something that sounded like longing. Maybe it was always complicated, Emma replied. Maybe we were just pretending it was simple. Julian stood abruptly, moving to the window, his back to her, tension radiating from every line of his body. Emma watched him, her heart pounding, knowing they'd reached some kind of precipice but not sure if they'd step back or leap forward. You should go to bed, Julian said without turning around. The storm is passing. It was a dismissal, clear and final. But Emma didn't move. Instead, she rose and crossed to where he stood, close enough that she could see his reflection in the rain-streaked window, close enough to see the conflict written on his face. Julian, she said. When he turned, she saw everything he'd been trying to hide. Desire and fear and longing and resistance, all warring in his expression. Don't, he warned, but he didn't move away. Don't what? Emma asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. Don't make me feel this, Julian said, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Don't make me want something I swore I'd never need again. Emma's hand came up to his face, cupping his jaw the way she had at the gala. And this time Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a sigh that sounded like surrender. I'm not trying to make you feel anything, Emma whispered. But maybe you're not as dead inside as you convinced yourself you were. Julian's eyes opened, and the look in them made Emma's breath catch. Hunger and tenderness and something fierce and possessive that sent heat flooding through her body. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face, and for a long moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something neither of them could take back. Then Julian moved, his free hand sliding into her hair, cradling the back of her head, and he pulled her to him with a desperation that matched the storm still raging outside. His mouth found hers in a kiss that was nothing like their chaste wedding kiss. This was heat and need and 5 years of denial breaking apart under the weight of everything they'd been pretending not to feel. Emma melted into him, her hands fisting in his t-shirt, rising on her toes to meet him fully. Julian kissed her like he was drowning and she was air, like she was something precious and necessary and impossible to resist. His tongue swept into her mouth, claiming and exploring, and Emma responded with equal hunger, pouring all her confused feelings into the kiss. The loneliness of the past weeks, the growing attraction she'd been fighting, the sympathy and understanding that had been building with every note they'd exchanged, every conversation they'd shared. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted the fierce passion of the kiss. "This wasn't part of the contract," he whispered, his voice ragged. Emma's hand slid up his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms. "Maybe the contract was wrong. Maybe we both need more than we thought we did." Julian's eyes searched hers, and Emma saw the moment he made his decision, saw the walls crumble, saw the desperate loneliness give way to desperate need. He kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense. And then he took her hand and led her from the studio, through the quiet house, to his wing, to his bedroom, the forbidden territory they'd agreed would remain separate. His room was surprisingly personal compared to the rest of the house. Books stacked on the nightstand, a photograph of his grandparents, a shirt draped over a chair. It was the room of someone who actually lived rather than just existed, and somehow that made Emma's nervousness ease slightly. Julian turned to face her, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "I need you to understand something. I haven't done this in 5 years. I don't know if I remember how to be present, how to make this about more than just physical release." Emma smiled, her hands sliding around his waist. "Then we'll figure it out together. Because I've never done this at all." Julian went very still. "You're a virgin? Is that a problem?" Emma asked, suddenly uncertain. "God, no." Julian's voice was rough with desire and something that might have been reverence. "But it means I need to be careful with you. Gentle. This can't be rushed." He kissed her again, slowly and thoroughly, his hands beginning to explore, sliding down her sides, tracing the curve of her waist, learning the shape of her through the thin silk of her robe. Emma's own hands grew bolder, slipping beneath his t-shirt to feel the warm skin and solid muscle of his back, drawing a groan from Julian that sent shivers through her. They undressed each other gradually, pausing frequently for kisses and touches, for whispered assurances and sharp intakes of breath. When Emma stood before him in nothing but the moonlight streaming through his window, Julian looked at her with such open appreciation that any embarrassment she might have felt dissolved into something warmer, something powerful. "You're beautiful," he murmured, and the sincerity in his voice made it feel like truth rather than flattery. He led her to his bed, and they tumbled onto the soft sheets together, skin against skin, heat building with every touch and kiss. Julian took his time, worshipping her body with hands and mouth, learning what made her gasp and arch and moan. He was patient and attentive, checking in with her constantly, making sure she was ready before he finally joined their bodies in a moment of exquisite intensity. Emma cried out, a mixture of discomfort and overwhelming sensation, and Julian held her through it, murmuring reassurances, kissing away the tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes, moving with careful restraint until the pain faded and pleasure took its place. Then Emma began to move with him, matching his rhythm, chasing something bright and desperate that built with every thrust. When release came, it crashed over them both like the storm outside, fierce and overwhelming and utterly transformative. Julian buried his face in Emma's neck, her name a prayer on his lips, and Emma clung to him, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. Some wall she'd built around her heart crumbling under the weight of this intimacy, this connection, this terrifying and wonderful surrender. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, skin cooling, hearts gradually slowing. Julian pulled Emma close, tucking her against his side with a tenderness that made her throat tight with emotion. "Stay," he whispered against her hair. "Don't go back to your wing tonight. Stay here with me." Emma nodded, pressing a kiss to his chest right over his heart. "I'll stay." As she drifted toward sleep in Julian's arms, Emma knew that everything had changed. The contract that had brought them together suddenly felt irrelevant compared to what had just happened between them. They'd crossed a line they could never uncross, opened a door they could never close, and Emma had no idea if that would ultimately save them both or destroy everything they'd carefully constructed. But as Julian's breathing deepened into sleep and his arms tightened around her, Emma decided that some risks were worth taking, even if the outcome was uncertain. Especially if the outcome was uncertain. Tomorrow would bring complications and conversations and consequences. But tonight, they were simply two lonely people who'd found something unexpected in each other's arms. Comfort, passion, and the terrifying possibility of something real. Emma woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the sensation of fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory flooded back in vivid detail. The storm, the studio, the kiss that had changed everything, and the hours of passionate discovery that had followed. She was in Julian's bed, and the man who'd been a careful stranger just weeks ago was watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. There was wonder in his eyes, mixed with uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite sure what the morning after protocol was for a marriage that had started as a business transaction and transformed into something infinitely more complicated. "Good morning," Julian murmured, his voice still rough with sleep, and there was something almost shy in the way he said it. "Good morning," Emma replied, suddenly aware of her nakedness beneath the sheets, of the pleasant soreness in her body that testified to everything they'd done, of the way Julian's eyes kept dropping to her lips as if remembering how they'd felt against his. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Emma saw vulnerability flickering in Julian's expression, a hesitancy that suggested he was just as lost in this new territory as she was. Then, as if making a decision, he leaned in and kissed her, slow and sweet and tender in a way that made Emma's chest ache with emotions she wasn't ready to name. When he pulled back, his hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I should probably tell you that I have no idea what I'm doing," he admitted quietly. "Last night was extraordinary, but I don't know how to navigate what happens next. I don't have a roadmap for this." Emma covered his hand with hers, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. "Then we figure it out together. That's how relationships work, isn't it? Two people stumbling forward and hoping they don't crash into too many walls along the way." A smile tugged at the corner of Julian's mouth, soft and genuine, so different from the controlled expressions he usually wore. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to be in a relationship. My track record speaks for itself." "Your track record is with the wrong person," Emma said firmly. Natalie wanted someone who would make her the center of his universe. That's not realistic or healthy. Real partners build a life together. They don't consume each other. Julian's eyes searched hers, and Emma could practically see him processing, analyzing, trying to reconcile his preconceptions about relationships with this new reality they'd stumbled into. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. But maybe it doesn't have to be as complicated as you've been making it either." Before Julian could respond, his phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, shattering the intimate bubble they'd created. He groaned, reaching for it, and Emma watched his expression shift from soft to sharp as he read whatever message had come through. "I have to go into the office," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "There's a crisis with the Tokyo acquisition that requires immediate attention." He looked at Emma, clearly torn, and added, "I'm sorry. I don't want to leave right now, but this can't wait." "I understand," Emma said, though disappointment settled in her chest. "You have a billion-dollar company to run. Go. We'll talk later." Julian hesitated, then kissed her again, hard and possessive, before forcing himself out of bed. Emma watched him disappear into the bathroom, admiring the lines of his body now that she had the right to look, and tried to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Last night had been transformative, but morning brought reality crashing back. They still had a contract, still had complications, still had all the messiness they'd been trying to avoid. After Julian left for the office, pressing one more lingering kiss to her forehead on his way out, Emma returned to her own wing and spent the day in a haze of confused emotions. She tried to read, tried to distract herself, but her mind kept returning to the feel of Julian's hands on her skin, the sound of her name on his lips, the unexpected tenderness beneath his passion. What had they done? They'd violated every boundary they'd established, crossed every line that was supposed to keep this arrangement clean and simple. And yet Emma couldn't bring herself to regret it. Not when she could still feel the ghost of Julian's touch on her body, not when she could remember the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and necessary. The answer to what they'd done came 3 days later in a form Emma hadn't anticipated. She was having coffee in the sunroom, reading a novel from Julian's extensive library, when Rebecca appeared with her usual efficient precision but with an unusual tightness around her eyes. "Mrs. Hawthorne, there's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Derek Morrison. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's insisting it's urgent and says you'll want to hear what he has to say." Emma's blood went cold. Derek Morrison, the man who'd been cruel at the gala, the man Julian had threatened, the business rival who seemed to delight in causing pain. What could he possibly want? "Tell him I'm not receiving visitors," Emma said firmly. Rebecca nodded and left, but she returned moments later, her expression troubled. "He says if you don't see him, he'll go straight to the press with information about your marriage. He claims he has evidence that it's a contractual arrangement rather than a genuine relationship." The bottom dropped out of Emma's stomach. If Derek had proof of their contract, if he could expose the arrangement publicly, Julian would lose everything. The company, his reputation, the inheritance his grandmother had intended for him. The scandal would be massive, and despite all the lawyer-approved language in their agreement, there was no way to spin it that wouldn't damage both of them irreparably. "Show him to the formal sitting room," Emma said quietly, her mind racing. "And Rebecca, please make sure the security team knows he's here. I don't trust him." Derek was waiting in the sitting room when Emma entered, his expensive suit and practiced smile doing nothing to mask the predatory gleam in his eyes. He rose as she entered, making a show of courtesy that felt like mockery. "Emma, thank you for seeing me. I know this is unexpected, but I think you'll want to hear what I have to offer." "What do you want, Derek?" Emma didn't offer him any courtesy he could twist into weakness. Derek pulled a folder from his briefcase and set it on the coffee table between them. "I want you to see what I have. Photographs of you signing documents in Julian's office weeks before your engagement was announced. Testimony from people who witnessed the arrangements. Financial records showing the debt payments that were made immediately after your wedding. It's all here, Emma. More than enough to prove that your marriage is a fraud." Emma's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. "So you're blackmailing us. What do you want? Money?" "I want Julian to suffer the way I suffered when he systematically destroyed my business relationships with his ruthless tactics," Derek said, and his voice carried real venom now. "I want him to lose everything. His company, his reputation, the respect he values more than human connection. Unless you're willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Emma asked, though she already suspected where this was going. "Divorce him. Quietly, quickly, with a public statement that the marriage was a mistake. I'll make it worth your while. $10 million, more than whatever Julian promised you. Walk away clean, let him face the consequences of his grandmother's ridiculous will, and I'll keep this evidence to myself." Emma stared at him, disgust rising like bile in her throat. This man had betrayed Julian once, and now he was trying to do it again, using Emma as his weapon. The cruelty of it, the calculated malice, made her sick. "Get out," Emma said quietly. Derek blinked. "Excuse me?" Get out of this house. Take your blackmail and your blood money and leave. I'm not helping you destroy my husband. Your husband? Derek laughed, harsh and mocking. Please, Emma. He's your employer. Don't pretend this is anything more than a business transaction. You're a smart woman. Take the money and run before this whole thing explodes in your face. The only thing that's going to explode is your pathetic attempt at revenge, Emma said, her voice shaking with rage. Julian is 10 times the man you'll ever be. He's brilliant and principled, and yes, maybe he's struggled with relationships, but at least he doesn't betray people who trusted him. At least he doesn't blackmail people for sport. She moved toward the door, opening it wide. You have 30 seconds to leave before I call security and have you removed. And if you go to the press with your evidence, we'll fight you. We'll expose every dirty deal you've made, every person you've screwed over, every lie you've told. Julian has resources you can't imagine and lawyers who will bury you in litigation for years.